Uh, Thanks so very much to Dr. Gustafson. It's a pleasure to be here at Villanova. Let's see. Yes, I'd like to say a special thank you to Professor Satya Patnaik and the Center for Latin American Studies and the Villanova community for the kind invitation to share some of my research on Japan. I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Patnaik in 2006 at a conference in Tokyo, and we've kept in touch ever since. So it's great to be here. I'm going to, here's an outline of my presentation. And I'm going to tell you a bit about my larger project first. But before I do that, I'm going to define some key terms, okay? Beyond that, a bit on the purpose of my larger study, the focus of today's presentation, the argument, the research question, etc. Okay? Okay, so political incorporation, what does that mean? Well, that refers to, following Michael Jones Correa, that means both the formal and informal means of participation in a given location, and the extent to which immigrants' interests are reflected in political outcomes and policies. By political transnationalism, I mean it refers to both a formal and informal political activity in both the country of origin and the host country. I'm going to talk a bit about the Dutch Caribbean because that's half of my research. And so by Dutch Caribbean, I mean the former overseas countries of the Netherlands, Antilles, and Aruba. You all know where that is, right? Just off the coast of, three of the islands just off the coast of Venezuela. Ethnicity, I'll just quickly go through this. Following Max Weber, ethnicity is defined as those human groups that entertain a subjective belief in their common descent because of similarities of physical type or of customs or both, or because of memories of colonization and migration, okay? And globalization, by that I mean, is characterized by inexorable interdependence, okay? And that's both economically, in terms of markets, in terms of communications, okay? Citizenship, I use citizenship and nationality interchangeably in this paper, okay? By citizenship, we mean legal membership that includes a broad range of civil, political, and social rights, right? But the pivotal right is that of participation in lawmaking. Okay, so those are some definitions. Let me tell you about my larger project. Okay. My larger project is entitled Inheriting the State, Post-Colonial Citizens and Ethnic Migration in the Netherlands and Japan during the Age of Globalization. So this is the title of my book prospectus that is now under review, and hopefully, if inshallah, it gets published. Okay, and this is based on my doctoral dissertation, and you see the title there. It's very long. I think this title sounds a lot better. I hope. Well, what does this research do? Well, it shows the ways in which globalization and state policy have worked in concert to produce migrations. It illustrates how globalization, migration, citizenship, and ethnicity actually interact and show the strange and contradictions of membership in liberal democratic states. What else does it do? I try to identify the determinant factors that impact immigrant political incorporation, as well as political transnationalism. And my cases demonstrate the ways in which belonging and membership are actually instrumentalized, right, manipulated by the state and various stakeholders for political gain at various times, regardless of shared legal citizenship or blood ties. Okay, the purpose of the larger study, obviously, right, to analyze globalization, the politics, migration, and the determinant factors impacting political incorporation or political transnationalism. And these are people who have inherited access to a liberal state, right? inherited access via the same formal citizenship or the same ethnicity. Okay, and so to analyze this, I have focused on post-colonial Dutch Antillean and Arubans who are actually legal Dutch citizens, kind of like Puerto Ricans, right? But people in Puerto Rico are U.S. citizens. People in the Dutch Antilles and Aruba are Dutch citizens, right? And with an EU Dutch passport, with the permanent right of abode in the Netherlands, they can go and travel to the Netherlands whenever they wish. And I chose Brazilian and Peruvian Nikkeijin in Japan. Well, they have access to a special visa that's based on their Japanese blood descent. Okay, but I'll get more into that soon. So the goal of this is the analysis of political, social, and economic forces that have produced these migrations, and again, to identify what actually limits or facilitates their political incorporation and political transnationalism. We can when we refer to the Netherlands, we can call the Netherlands a reluctant country of immigration, following the typology of Wayne Cornelius, a reluctant country of immigration. You've probably heard about the recent case of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands and his Islamophobia with his, Freedom Party. So it's a reluctant country of immigration. And Japan, we can call a latecomer to immigration, right? Mass migration to Japan is fairly recent. Okay, we know about the Korean community in Japan, but I want to talk more about the Nikkei community in relation to the Korean community. Okay, so these are critical case studies because in the last century, these older liberal democracies have had contentious experiences with both post-colonial and ethnic migrations. So the rationale here is that if political incorporation is difficult for people who are advantaged legal immigrants, right, then it's going to be even more daunting for others, right? So in this way, post-colonial citizen and ethnic immigrants can act as the miner's canary for all. Does everybody follow me? Okay, so in addition to demographic and other statistical data, the research employs original data based on well over, at this point, 160 in-depth interviews conducted in 2006, 7, 9, 10, and 11 with national and local politicians, government officials, local leaders in both the Dutch Kingdom, that is the Netherlands and the Dutch Islands, and Japan. Okay, let me take off my jacket. The findings of my larger study, I just briefly share. My research suggests that globalization and state policies have actually produced a convergence in the use of citizenship and ethnicity in migrations to the Netherlands and Japan. By the way, something I did not mention is that these migrations happened at the same time, 1985, 1990. Okay? Despite their shared legal citizenship or ethnicity, I find limited political incorporation and political transnationalism, and actually in both cases. I argue that shared citizenship with a common thread of civic and liberal ideology in the Netherlands, and co-ethnicity in what we think of as an ethnically exclusive and conservative Japan does not necessarily lead to political incorporation. Okay, so based on 6 years of research, my analysis demonstrates that limited political opportunity structure, along with the difficulties of small group size, language, and a myth of return, right? This is the idea that I'm always going back. This actually hinders immigrant political incorporation. As for the political transnationalism, I contend home country level of dependence on migrant remittances, electoral rules and practices that complicate overseas voting, and a dearth of active host country ethnic advocacy organizations limits the emergence of political transnationalism. So now you're saying to yourself, when is he going to get to the what we're going to talk about today? So here we go. I will. So the title of my presentation is Blood Thicker Than Water, right? The political incorporation of Latin American Nikkeijin blood descendants in Japan. Okay, so this is based on research conducted in the summer of 2006 for my doctoral dissertation. And subsequent research was conducted in 2009 as well as 2010. This research has resulted in two publications. One, based on what I'm about to present, was recently published in the Japanese Journal of Political Science, published by Cambridge University Press. And research conducted in 2009 was published in 2010 in a guest edited issue of Policy and Society. Okay. So I presented earlier versions of this paper at Sophia University in Japan, the International Studies Association Convention in New York, as a fellow at Stanford, at Southern Methodist University, and also recently to Japanese government officials. That was fun. That was fun. Additionally, I'd like to express my gratitude to the American Political Science Association for their small research grant that helped to fund this, as well as the Professional Staff Congress of CUNY. Okay, all right. So let's talk about Japan. Well, many of you know that Japan maintains strict restrictions on immigration, and still actually prohibits unskilled immigrant labor. You may also know that the Japanese government helped to coordinate previous out-migrations of Japanese people to Latin America in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Okay, by the 1980s in booming Japan, there was a need for cheap labor, and more people from South Asia were arriving in Japan from the Middle East, actually. And some argued that this was resented due to Japan's nationalist ideology of common ethnic ancestry. Okay, and this actually led to a change in policy that allowed Japanese descendants to come back and live and work on a special visa called the Teijusha visa, based on their status as Japanese descendants. So this policy was established by the 1990 Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act. It enables second and third generation, or what we call Nikkeijin, Japanese descendants from around the world, to legally live and work in Japan. And even spouses and children are able to stay for up to 1 year, but with unlimited renewals. And this enabled a mass transnational family migration. Although they were at first thought to be what are known as dekasegis, or temporary migrant workers, their increasing permanence has become evident over time. Okay, so it should be noted that most Nikkeijin in Japan, they come from Brazil and Peru, right? These are countries with very large Japanese descendant communities. And between 1985 to 2004, the number of registered Brazilians and Peruvians in Japan went from just 2,000 to almost 350,000. Okay, at the end of 2004, the number of foreign nationals registered in Japan hit a record high of just under 2 million. And so you can see there's been a tremendous increase of population over a relatively short period of time. It's been noted that the Brazilian and Peruvian Nikkeijin and other Latin American Nikkeijin groups have come to be the third largest group of foreigners in Japan and the country's newest ethnic minority, after the Zainichi Korean and Chinese communities. Okay, some characteristics of group characteristics of Nikkeijin. Well, very few have political rights or citizenship in Japan, just between 9 and 10%. When you think of Nikkeijin, you might think of the Ostleader, the ethnic Germans in Germany, but their treatment is quite different, right? The ethnic Germans in Germany, up until recently, well, they were given German citizenship. They actually helped them to settle with housing allowances, funding. The Nikkeijin are just extended visa privileges, and they're perceived as foreigners and offered very little assistance in Japan. The Ostleader, in the German case, well, they're courted by the CSU and CDU political parties in Germany. Okay, and they try to emphasize the shared heritage of Germans as opposed to the guest workers. Okay, but both the Ostleader and Nikkeijin are the lower ends of the labor market. Something else I should note is that many of the Nikkeijin are second generation or third generation, and were born in Latin America with very little Japanese language ability, okay, or cultural familiarity. And so I should also add that sometimes they're demonized or stigmatized in the media through an association with crime. Okay, which is kind of surprising, but true. Uh-oh. Okay, good. All right, the aim of the paper, obviously, to discuss the political incorporation of these groups in Japan between the years 1990 to 2004. The argument is Japan's ethnic citizenship regime and political opportunity structure, as well as the structure of civil society, that is the way the state structures civil society, combined with language difficulties, the newness of residence, low minority status, and the powerful myth of return limit Nikkei political incorporation in Japan. Research questions. As co-ethnicity is what provides the eligibility for the visa that makes Nikkeijin legal in Japan, what role, if any, does co-ethnicity play in formal and informal political processes? Why doesn't the Japanese government extend full legal citizenship to Nikkeijin like the Germans or the Italians or other governments do for their overseas co-ethnics? And in short, what limits or facilitates the political incorporation of these co-ethnic groups from Latin America in Japan? Hypotheses. Co-ethnicity implies full community membership that facilitates integration and political incorporation. In his analysis of political incorporation and participation of, I should stress, immigrant non-citizen guest workers from Turkey, Algeria, and Morocco in Europe, Mark Miller at the University of Delaware found prior to and after being extended political rights, non-citizen guest workers in Europe engaged in what we call extra-electoral participation. That includes homeland participation, consultative voice, participation in union and factory councils, political, religious, civic organizations, and parliamentary opposition. So the Nikkeijin are in a similar situation to those non-citizen guest workers in Europe. Okay, but we would assume that because of their shared ethnicity or blood connections, that it should ease their social and political incorporation. On the methodology, the approach is comparative, historical, and empirical. I've already mentioned that I used quantitative demographic, naturalization, and other statistical data from local government and local and national governments, and qualitative data in the form of interviews and textual analysis of relevant government documents, and also from NGOs and community organizations to look at the political incorporation of first generation Latin American Nikkei immigrants in Japan. And because most of them, lack formal citizenship or political rights, I used Mark Miller's method and looked for signs of both formal and extra electoral participation. Okay, so for this, this was done with 25 structured and semi-structured interviews over several months in 2006 with national and local politicians, policymakers, NGOs, community organizations, community activists, journalists, diplomatic representatives, and local governments with older and newer high concentrations of Brazilian and Peruvian Nikkeijin and other immigrants. That's so I went to Toyota City, Hamamatsu City, and Kawasaki City in Japan. An additional 25 interviews was conducted in 2009 in Ota and Oizumi, and 10 more on return in 2010. I'll just quickly tell you, Hamamatsu is located about 160 miles southwest of Tokyo in Shizuoka Prefecture and has one of the largest populations of Latin American Nikkeijin immigrants in Japan. It's an industrial city known for the Yamaha, Kawai, Suzuki, Honda corporations that produce motorcycles, automobiles, musical instruments, etc. And what happens is many of these Latin American Nikkei immigrants, they work for small subcontractors that are contracted by these corporations to produce parts for their industries. Right? So somewhat cheaper labor, right? Toyota City is named after, you guessed it, Toyota, right? And Toyota City is located in Aichi Prefecture, partly adjacent to Shizuoka. And yeah, it's the head office of the Toyota Motor Corporation. It has one of the largest residential concentrations of Brazilians in Japan, with many living in this immense public housing complex called the Homidanchi. You can ask me about it in question and answer. And finally, Kawasaki City is an industrial city in the northeastern corner of Kanagawa Prefecture, adjacent to Tokyo, metropolitan Tokyo. And it has one of the largest foreign resident communities in Japan, but particularly the long-standing and very old Zainichi Korean community of foreign residents. So in each of these cities, foreigners comprise between 2 to 3.85% of the city. Informants were identified through newspapers and websites and employed a snowball sampling technique, making contacts for my interviews through government officials, scholars, political parties, activists, initially in New York, followed by outreach on the ground. So this paper argues again that Japan's ethnic citizenship regime, political opportunity structure, and structure of its civil society, along with the group variables that I've already mentioned, these combine to limit their political incorporation. What are some findings? Well, my research and interviews indicate, again, very limited Nikkei immigrant political incorporation at all levels, actually, in Japan, demonstrating that shared ethnicity doesn't necessarily facilitate immigrant political incorporation. Nikkei were not extended citizenship or political rights because the original intent of the 1990 Act was based on temporary stay rather than permanent residency. Given that still, some PAC and others have argued that some Japanese local governments have actually positively reacted to their proximity to Nikkei legal immigrants, and actually defied the policies of the national government by including them as local citizens. She argues that this has led local governments to use actually the internationalization policies of the national government in ways to provide outreach to foreigners. There's clearly a disconnect between the central and the local governments on immigration policy. The local governments basically have to bear the weight, right, of the problems associated with immigration. So there has been some policy innovation on the local level towards more incorporation in the form of foreign residence assemblies, right, which are unfortunately are just limited to making suggestions, but still they exist, but not in every city. There's also local referenda and ombudsman. There's also a committee for localities with a concentrated foreigner population. There are also community unions, but unfortunately, these appear to be inadequate. The 1990s reform of the electoral system to a mixed member system, combining proportional representation and single member districts, has actually turned away some previous LDP, that is Liberal Democratic Party privilege and dominance, and has actually produced a few more women and ethnic minorities in parliament, but not one Latin American Nikkei descendant. Okay, one counterintuitive finding is that the politicians and policymakers I interviewed on the national and local levels expressed the sentiment that actually Zainichi Koreans should be extended voting rights before the Nikkeijin. And I don't know if you know, but Zainichi Koreans are a long-standing excluded group in Japan. So I found that very surprising. Although there's media coverage of groups and even political parties like the New Komeito Party advocating for voting rights for Zainichi Koreans and other permanent residents, one rarely sees media coverage or groups advocating for local voting rights for Nikkeijin. I find little evidence of Nikkei organizations that mobilize for political advocacy. This quote says a lot about how Latin American Nikkeijin are seen in Japan and how they perceive themselves in Japan. And this is from a Japanese NGO official in Toyota City. When they come to Japan, they can come because of their blood as Japanese. They consider themselves as Japanese, but here they're considered as foreigners, and they'll be discriminated in a lot of media. I think Nikkeis here don't consider themselves as Japanese. And do the Japanese consider the Nikkei Japanese part of them? No, okay, my emphasis. But my Nikkei informants informed me of their strong feeling of Brazilian or Peruvian identity once in Japan, and their treatment as outsiders. This is from a Brazilian priest, a priest and activist. He says, the Nikkei still feel themselves as Brazilians or Japanese. The Brazilian Nikkei feel themselves as a Brazilian. The children are born in Japan, but their nationality is Brazilian, and they don't take the Japanese nationality. So, with regard to the ethnic citizenship regime, my findings indicate that Japan's jus sanguinis ethnic citizenship regime is characterized by a relatively closed naturalization policy that is less integrative of immigrants because of its racially and ethnically determined blood basis for citizenship. Actually facilitates the emigration of those with shared blood ties. But ironically, it is also one of the principal facts that actually limits their social and political incorporation. I argue that the Nikkeijin find themselves included outside of Japan, and excluded once in the country. Okay, But it's also important to note that Japan's naturalization law was somewhat liberalized in 1984. Few Nikkeijin, the literature says, want to naturalize because they'll have to lose their original citizenship, and they want to go back. But naturalizations have actually, you can see here, have actually increased from the Zainichi Korean and Chinese communities. According to the Ministry of Justice, there's something like 15,000 Zainichi Koreans and Chinese naturalized every year to the Japanese nationality. And so I argue that this actually denotes a change in attitudes. But you don't see the same thing happening, though, with the Brazilian or Peruvian community, at least not up until 2004. Okay. And of course, that's despite decades of discrimination. But we can talk more about that during the question and answer, because I think I'm filling the time. As far as political opportunity structure, I argue that changes in Japan's political opportunity structure, or that is political resources external to Nikkeijin communities, between 1990 and 2004, have actually opened up access to participation for more political actors and some excluded groups. For example, the recent, Japan was a one-party state, right, for something like for many years, for decades. So up until the recent change of government in the summer of 2009, with the electoral victory of the Democratic Party of Japan, my research indicates that the Liberal Democratic Party single-party dominance of the political opportunity structure is actually a factor and helps to explain the limited Nikkeijin political incorporation. But the 1994 reform of the electoral system has actually changed the political opportunity structure. And you can see here a few people of foreign origin have actually been elected. Okay. And most have been elected by proportional representation, right? That is said to be better for minorities and women. And you can see here, the first, one is Mr. Surunen, who's actually from Finland and naturalized some years ago. He's the first foreign-born politician in Japanese history to be elected to the upper house in 2001. There's also Mr. Haku, a naturalized Japanese in 2002 of mixed Korean and Japanese parentage from the discriminated Korean minority. And the first, he says, the first politician to openly express his Korean background to be elected to the upper house in 2004. And there's also Ren Hao, who's actually a television personality. She was elected via SMD, representing Tokyo, and all as members of the Democratic Party of Japan. Here's a quote from the self-declared first openly Korean member of the House of Councilors, that is the upper house. I was the first elected as a publicly known Korean Japanese. My mother's country is Japan, and my father's country is Korea. All the people here, they know me, they know my origin. It's very popular in a special way. All the Japanese people voted for me. Nowadays, the Japanese people are changing very much. Maybe, in my case, maybe 10 years ago, a Korean, oh no, but nowadays, a Korean, okay, I'll vote. I think it's a very significant thing that you only have one vote, and you're giving your vote to a Korean foreign person. But gaijin is not such a nice word. Okay. So my interviews revealed that despite co-ethnicity, the demands of the Zainichi Koreans are actually seen as more legitimate in comparison to the Nikkeijin. Most informants favored extension of local suffrage to Zainichi Koreans rather than Nikkei. And you can see this here in this quote. And so in terms of priority, I do believe those who are living in Kawasaki for a longer time are the Korean residents and should be considered first a priority when giving the right to vote instead of Nikkeis. If you look at the bills for foreign suffrage that have been introduced, right? Many of the bills have been aimed at the Korean, Zainichi Korean and Chinese special permanent residents, okay, and not the Nikkeijin. One observation, and I'll close soon. One observation is that although there are 200 foreign support organizations, such as the Catholic Commission of Japan for Migrants, Refugees, and People on the Move, Solidarity Network with Migrants Japan, etc. There's actually a very active Portuguese and Spanish press in Japan as well. But what you see is an absence of Nikkei organizations dedicated to political advocacy. There are lots of, you'll see in this quote here, there are lots of sports associations and dance and cultural associations, all right, et cetera, but none really dedicated to political advocacy. And I think that has to do with the way civil society is structured in Japan. Okay, up until recently, it was actually fairly difficult to start and establish a political advocacy organization in Japan. Pekkanen argues that Japan has a dual pattern of civil society in which there are many neighborhood associations, but very few professional advocacy organizations. And he refers to the strict legal framework, the limited funding pattern, indirect regulations, such as postal regulations that make bulk mailing for civil society organizations very, very expensive. Also, too, obtaining tax exempt status remains difficult. Although lobbying is permitted, the lack of access to tax deductible contributions makes most groups who already lack resources less viable in issue advocacy. So you have lots of service provider organizations that are usually run by Japanese citizens and not the Nikkei themselves. As for unions, you would think that that because something like 86% of Nikkei are employed in the manufacturing industry in Japan. So one would assume class as a basis for collective action and or participation. But again, this has to do with the way in which civil society is structured in Japan. Most of Japan's 20,000 unions are organized on the basis of company specific enterprises, okay, rather than industry. And these unions usually do not allow part-time workers, and many Nikkei are just that. They're part-time and contract workers. Okay, so this can actually act as an impediment to collective action. But despite this fact, there are a few community unions which are generally open to any individual, including some that work with foreign workers. One example is the Kanagawa City Union in Kawasaki, which actually provides labor consultation and also works to settle labor disputes. Other organizations are religious organizations. Well, most of the Nikkei and also the Filipino community are Catholics, and so actually the Catholic community has been religious-based organizations have been are viable, and as they see their Christian duty to help them and also protect their faith. So I would say Catholic organizations and community unions appear to be the most open, okay, for political advocacy of Nikkeijin. Okay, I think I better close soon. Let me just add one more thing. Okay, so my research and interviews, they indicate that in addition to the structural variables that I've already named, the group variables of language, the relative newness, the small size, and the low minority status, as well as a powerful myth of return, these combine to limit the Nikkei participation. And actually, Koreans are seen as a much more viable group. I'll stop after this. Here's a quote from a long-term resident and foreign community activist. Well, Korean residents in Japan have long established groups. They have big voices in politics here. Those voices have been around a lot of change in laws related to foreigners in Japan. For example, the elimination of fingerprints from the foreign registration cards took place about 7 to 8 years ago. And that was primarily because of pressure from Korean residents. There's also the same basis for local representation for non-citizens in politics, primarily to appease Korean residents. Okay. And I'd just like to add that during the financial crisis, I suppose we're not out of it yet, but in March 2009, the Japanese government actually came up with a program to actually repatriate the Nikkeijin, initially on the promise of $2,000, I believe, on the promise that they never return. And due to organizing of Nikkei groups, they actually they took that back and said it was a mistake, and that was changed. And that program ended in 2010. You can see the quote here. They put up with us as long as they needed the labor, but now the economy is bad. They throw us a bit of cash and say goodbye. That's from the New York Times. And again, so some organizing did take place in reaction to that. Okay. So in conclusion, what does this tell us? Well, as the title of my paper suggests, is blood thicker than water? Well, my answer is it's relational. Okay, this case it says a lot about the conditionalities of membership and the ways in which they are instrumentalized by both the state and non-state actors. It tells us also about how ethnic sentiments can inform immigration policy and the perspectival and relational nature of the politics of ethnicity and nationality. All of this says much about the disconnect between the nationalist sentiment that fuels immigration policy and the outcomes in terms of integration and political incorporation. And oddly enough, although the policy was made to maintain ethnic homogeneity, it may have actually pushed the doors open to the realities of an increasingly multicultural Japan.